What does the Act state? Let's just unpack the Act briefly and understand what it says. So it is the Act, this is what gives rise to Section 2172, explaining the framework for the implementation of the procurement policy contemplated in Section 2172. It defines organs of state, national provincial departments, municipalities, constitutional institutions, parliament, provincial legislatures, and any institutional category of institution identified in the definition of organ of state. One of those that I think now is being debated now and concluded is tertiary institutions also fall under this definition. The definition section of the Act is very lean. There is not much that it defines. It defines a couple of key terms in the Act. And one of those terms is acceptable tender. Means any tender which in all respects complies with the specifications and conditions of tender as set out in the tender document. This, I believe, is going to become a very important discussion point for you in your policies, is what is going to constitute an acceptable tender. Section 1 goes on to then describe the framework. And 2.1 is the important part that was referred to by the Constitutional Court, which says that an organ of state must determine its preferential procurement policy and implement it within the following framework, and goes through then and talks about a preference point system where there's 10 points and 90 points and 20 points and 80 points. And there is a formula which must be prescribed. This threshold of where the 90-10 and 80-20 starts must be prescribed as well. And that's what we will get in the Preferential Procurement Regulations 2022. So at a minimum, there will be a threshold that will come through in the regulations, as well as the formulae. So that is 2.1. And it's probably been lost. It's been around for since 2000. I almost said 2,000 years. It's been around since 2000, so 22 years. And many organs of state have missed this, and probably have missed it because the definition says that it's the procurement policy contemplated in terms of Section 2172 of the Constitution. And people have just been saying, well, it's our policy, and therefore, we don't need to do anything. But it's very, very deliberate. 2172 of the Constitution is what this policy needs to address. 2172. 2172 says, subsection 1 does not prevent the organ of state or institutions referred into that subsection from implementing a procurement policy, not framework, policy, providing for categories of preference in the allocation of contracts. Categories of preference in the allocation of contracts and the protection or advancement of persons or categories of persons disadvantaged by unfair discrimination. Now, I do not know many organs of state that have even defined in their policy the categories of preference in the allocation of contracts. Critical. Have defined the categories of persons disadvantaged by unfair discrimination. What many have done is just taken the framework that we received from the Minister of Finance and said, this framework is our policy. There's a very important word in 2.1. It says the organ of state must determine its preferential procurement policy. And there is the details then. So a preference point system must be followed, describing the 90 and the 10 and the 20 and the 80. Contracts for a RAD value above the prescribed maximum of 10 points must be allocated for specific goals as contemplated in paragraph D. We'll have a look at paragraph D shortly. But this is going to be the major part of the policy work that has to be done, is what are those points that are going to make up the 10 and the 20 points, and how are you going to do that and define the point scoring mechanism that you're going to be using in your organization. And just picking up there on the prescribed here means prescribed by regulation made under section 5. We'll briefly look at section 5. 2.1c goes on to say any acceptable tenders which are higher in price must score fewer points on a pro rata basis calculated on the tender prices in relation to the lowest acceptable tender in accordance with a prescribed formula. So that's just that formula that we all know, and it's unlikely to be any different to what we've had for the last 22 years. There does seem to be an attempt by Treasury to introduce another formula for the so-called reverse formula for disposals. We will touch on that shortly. 2.1d is very important. The specific goals may include contracting for persons or categories of persons historically disadvantaged by unfair discrimination on the basis of race, gender, or disability. It may include implementing the programs of the Reconstruction and Development Program as published in Government Gazette 16085, dated November 1994. So the specific goals may include these. And that's why it's so important that the organ of state determine. You need to decide which of these specific goals, what are your specific goals that you're going to use to decide the score. And E is why I believe this is going to take a little bit longer than we expect. But not E is the start, sorry. I think it's G is going to be the one that's going to be the difficult one. Any specific goal for which a point may be awarded must be clearly specified in the invitation to submit a tender. Clearly specified in the invitation to submit a tender. Here it is, 2. It's a 2-2. Okay, 2-2. PPPFA section 2-2. Any goals contemplated in subsection 1E must be measurable, quantifiable, and monitored for compliance. That's the one that's going to take some time. That's going to mean that we've got to make sure that this point scoring process that we put together must be measurable, quantifiable, and monitored for compliance. F then is the objective criteria. 1.2.1F, the contract must be awarded to the tenderer who scores the highest points unless objective criteria, in addition to those contemplated in paragraphs D and E, may, the one that says may, justify the award to another tender. So that's FG then just says, hey, if you're lying, then any contract awarded on account of false information furnished by the tenderer in order to secure preference in terms of this act may be cancelled with the sole discretion of the organ of state without prejudice to any other remedies the organ of state may have. Section 3 of the Act brings in the exemptions. We've looked at this at some point in time. Some of you might actually be thinking maybe there is merit in requesting exemption on certain aspects of the regulations, particularly if you are one that deals quite a lot with international suppliers. You can certainly go through that process. National Treasury has got, the Minister has got lots of experience in the last while as to how to deal with the requests for exemptions. But certainly is a question that you need to probably be asking going forward. Section 4 is the last section, second last section of the Act. Just as a transitional provision, any procurement process implemented under preferential procurement policy where the invitation to tender was advertised before commencement of the Act must be finalized as if this Act did not come into operation. I think it's a key point that many missed when the Constitutional Court's decision came through 2 weeks ago. The final decision came through 2 weeks ago, a very important point, section 4. And 5 then is the one that had the primary focus of the Constitutional Court, where it basically said the minister may make regulations regarding any matter that may be necessary or expedient to prescribe in order to achieve the objects of the Act. If there's any legal scholars, you want to have a look at the Constitution, and particularly the majority write-up in that case on the whole discussion around necessary or expedient, and the that term, necessary or expedient. Draft regulations must be published for public comment in the Government Gazette and every provincial gazette before promulgation. And again, there's just the prescribed issue here on means prescribed by regulation made under section 5. So that's a summary of the Act.